It's a really great privilege for me this morning to be with you and to rehearse some of the stories of ANZAC, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, and what it means. So when Gideon, a proud New Zealander, asked me, a proud Australian who was born in New Zealand, to share some of the stories of ANZAC and to celebrate this special time, I didn't really hesitate because it's something that's very precious to each one of us and precious to me. They went with songs to the battle. They were young, straight of limb, true of eye, steady and aglow. They were staunch to the end against odds uncounted, and they fell with their faces to the foe, which is the verse of the poem preceding the one that Rob read for us previously. So ANZAC Day is probably the most sacred day of the year for most Australians. And even in the strangest of times when we're not sure whether we can march or whether we've got to go out in front of our house to spend ANZAC dawn service by ourselves, it is a wonderful thing to recall, an unusual time. But it's wonderful that this year we can march, we can attend the march. And in every city and town and village, Australians will be gathering for their dawn services and marches to commemorate this ANZAC Day. Little children, teens hustled out of bed in the darkness with their parents, standing in the cold, cool pre-dawn as they acknowledge the cost of freedom. And even though last year we simply had to listen to the lone bugler in a driveway in the suburbs, that will probably still happen in many cases, because I think a new tradition now has been established. Some will go to the marches and some will stand proudly in their driveways. And we are normally gregarious people who love to get out and about, and this COVID restriction doesn't sit well with us, does it? And we chafe a little bit at having to sit in this particular seat, and we have to chafe when we got to sign into all these places, and you go to a restaurant and you've got to leave your details. It doesn't rest easy with us. But as the events have unfolded with the issues of this dread pandemic that has caused such a problem with us, one of the great things that we can be grateful for is that we live in a great country. Right around the world there are people contracting this disease, but you know, in Australia nobody contracted it. And we are happy to live in that environment, and people have brought it in as they've travelled, but there's very little contraction of this disease. And so ANZAC Day, let's think about it a little bit. Had its origins on April 25, 1915. We celebrate it tomorrow. Over 100 years ago, it wasn't a mighty victory that we celebrated, but it was a defeat and a withdrawal that we remember. And Australians are good at doing things like that, aren't they? Remembering those things. But it has special significance for us as Australians because it was our first involvement in a war as a separate, federated, united nation, and it signified our coming of age. It established our identity in the world as distinctly Australian. You remember the stories, so many of them. But young Australian and New Zealand soldiers were sent to fight for king and country on a far distant shore. In fact, to invade that shore. They went off to war with the attitude that this was a great adventure, like going to the footy. They were soon to realise that it was no game. And the performance of these soldiers from Australia and New Zealand set a standard by which all Australian forces from that time forward are judged. Even though they had trained hard in Egypt, they were inexperienced in war, but in the furnace of bitter, close, hand-to-hand combat, traditions were forged that have shone brightly ever since in our nation. And they can be described in single words. You can pick out the word that you might choose: courage, endurance, self-sacrifice, mateship, equality, initiative, and leadership by example. Shortly after 2 a.m. on the 25th of April, 3 battleships arrived off what was later to become known as ANZAC Cove. They sat quietly, assembled on the decks, 1,500 Australian soldiers. Then with heavy packs and their rifles slung over their shoulders, they went down the ladders into the darkness. Quietly packed together in the boats, they were towed towards the shore, and as the dawn was breaking, the signal was given, and the men jumped out of the boats and waded the last 50 metres to the shore. Most stumbled through the water to the beach. Some were hit as they were doing that by the Turkish bullets. A few were even dragged down by the weight of their packs and tragically drowned. The men had been told that they would find level ground and fairly easy going. Instead of this, an unknown cliff reached up before them. And as they hauled themselves up, clutching at roots and boulders and kicking footholds in the dirt, a heavy fire came down from them from the heights above, and bullets and shrapnel pinged all around them, and soon the air was filled with shouts and with cries, and some lost their grip and tumbled down into the gullies. Those that actually reached the top went charging off after the enemy, and they were soon lost. And the sunrise saw a scene that was never imagined in the battle plans. And the wild scramble went on and on and on, and no one could be sure of anything except that the Allies were ashore and starting to build up their reinforcements. In actual fact, they never actually captured very much more land than was achieved in that first mad, frenzied battle. They were there to stay, and there were many acts of heroism, and we could spend weeks thinking about the stories and all of those issues that come through about the Gallipoli campaign. And we haven't even got time to just touch on the surface. But one of the first diggers to hit the beach at Gallipoli was Albert Jacka, who joined up in the first few days of the war and served with such distinction that his whole battalion was known as Jacka's Mob. On one occasion, he succeeded in capturing a Turkish trench by diving in headfirst and subduing the occupants in there. And it's the stuff of legend that when his commanding officer peered over the strangely silent trench, Jacka was lazily smoking a cigarette and commented lazily, "Oh, well, managed to get the beggar, sir." He would eventually go on to win the Victoria Cross 3 times over. He survived the war, and when he died in 1932, his 8 pallbearers were all the winners of the Victoria Cross. The only men who were good enough to take such a champion to the grave. It wasn't only the soldiers, there were others. There were the medics, the signallers, the transport officers, the engineer, and the chaplains. Roman Catholic Father John Fay, chaplain of the 11th Battalion from Western Australia. The chaplains were not supposed to be in the first landing, but John Fay was unwilling to be left behind, and he stowed away on the landing craft so that he could be among his men when they landed. In fact, he was the only chaplain of any denomination on the peninsula for many days. He buried the dead, offered comfort to the living, whether they were Catholic or Protestant or Jewish or unbelievers, and he stayed alongside the men in dugouts and in the trenches. His career was actually touched with miracle. At the landing, he found a large flat stone on the beach, and he held it up in front of his head, and seconds later a Turkish bullet smacked into that rock, and while all around him were dead. He later related that during his time on Gallipoli, 4 shrapnel bullets ripped through his haversack, destroying all the contents. A bullet passed clean through his overcoat and left him without a scratch. He had a book shot out of his hand. A jam tin from which he was eating was blown apart. His tobacco tin was drilled, and his waterproof sheet was torn apart by bullets. And he commented, "Having escaped so far, I don't think I can get hit." He wrote to his father 4 weeks after the landing. Another chaplain was Fighting Mac, William Mackenzie. On the 6th of August 1915, Mackenzie's battalion was waiting to attack the Turks at Lone Pine. The Turkish trenches were deep, covered with logs and earth, and everyone knew that the attack would be costly. Mackenzie should have been in the rear trenches, but he was there with his men. As the men charged, Mackenzie followed, carrying not a rifle but a spade. And he was to need it because over the next few years he sorted the living from the dead, and he buried 450 men. And for his actions at Gallipoli, he was decorated with the Military Cross. Well, there were months of stalemate in the trenches to come, and through the terrible heat of the summer and the freezing cold of the approaching winter, with steady losses due to casualties and illness, and life in the trenches was absolutely terrible. The food was bad, monotonous, and then there was the stench, that overpowering smell of death over the battlefield, and with that came the flies. And I have a poem about the flies at Gallipoli, which I won't take time to read. There was always a sniper's bullet to take out the careless. And the story of Gallipoli is told in the cemeteries that are dotted over the battlefield. It is a moving experience, a sobering experience to visit the little cemeteries all over the battlefield. Each grave has its own story. Private T.H. Mills from Bendigo, killed in action and buried at Lone Pine. His epitaph, "He died to save Australia," our ANZAC hero. He died to save Australia. Then there was John Simpson. I found his grave when I was there on one occasion. And he was the man with the donkey, the man who so bravely saved so many lives that he became an Australian icon. And he was carrying a wounded man down through Shrapnel Gully, and he found a donkey. And he would sing and he would whistle, and he was seemingly able to ignore the bullets flying around him while he tended his charge, and said he had at least 5 donkeys. 5 donkeys, each named Duffy 1, Duffy 2, Murphy, Queen Elizabeth, and Abdul. And some of those donkeys were killed and wounded in action. But if you look at the date of his grave, you notice that he only lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks, and he built that legend. I found the grave also of Trooper Bert Bellinger, 19 years of age, young man in the prime of his youth, firing through a loophole when a bullet came in and glanced across the rifle and took him out and killed him. Then there was Commander Edward Cater, and he was there on the beach. I found his grave too. He was in charge of the landings at ANZAC Cove, and he won everybody's respect by helping others to avoid the shell fire on the beach. And the Aussies knew him as the bloke with the eyeglass. You've seen pictures of these English gentlemen with the monocle in their eye. Many British officers wore them for some reason, but Cater's was a king-size one, a big one. And with the irreverent humour of some of the Australian soldiers, whenever they came past Commander Cater, they'd stick their dog tags in their eye and try and ridicule him. He looked at them, removed his eyeglass, and he threw it up in the air, and he caught it back in his eye, and he said, "There you are, you blighters, you do that." He was killed on the beach when he ran to help some men who were being hit by shrapnel fire. On August 7, 1917, on the tiny battlefield of the Neck, right up on the top of the ridge, where the trenches were separated only by the width of the road, the narrow road, where the ANZACs could throw a tin of bully beef across the road to land in the Turkish trenches, and the Turks would throw back a tin of tobacco for them. The Light Horse Regiment charged out of their trenches in 3 waves of 150 men, and they were cut to pieces as they leapt over the top. And Trooper Harold Rush, we'll get there. Trooper Harold Rush of the 10th Light Horse Regiment died in the 3rd wave, and his body was one of the few identified, and he is buried in Walker's Ridge Cemetery up on the top, and his epitaph famously reads, his last words, "Goodbye, Cobber, God bless you." Last in December, the decision was made to evacuate, which was the best planned and executed operation of the whole campaign, and not one of the Allied soldiers died in the evacuation. And it marked the ultimate failure of the campaign and victory for the Turks. But after the withdrawal from Gallipoli, the Anzac soldiers were sent to the Western Front in France, there to confront a different enemy and fight the Germans on the battlefields of the Flanders and the Somme. They were tired. They were ill-prepared. They didn't have the right equipment. They'd been fighting for months in a different place. And some of them, a third of them, didn't even have helmets. Within a week, they saw their first action at a place called Fromelles in France. The Germans had been there for a year, and they were dug in with concrete bunkers. But the Aussies and the New Zealanders' time was measured in days. Allied soldiers were told to recapture the ground captured by the Germans. They successfully did this, and they breached the first German line, but the second line was not where the troops had been told it would be, and it was a disastrous mistake. Forced out into no man's land, the British, Australian and New Zealand troops were ruthlessly cut down by the machine guns just scything through the people. In one night of fighting, there were 5,533 casualties. Can you imagine that? 5,533 casualties, killed, missing and wounded with 2,000 dead. And the majority of the bodies lay out in no man's land for the next 3 years before they could be retrieved. Those who were wounded were stuck in shell holes and on the barbed wire, and no one could go out in daylight to get them. But over the next 3 or 4 days, a few brave souls would sneak out at night to the rescue. The Australians could hear and see the movement out in no man's land. They went out to try and recover their wounded cobbers. In the days after the battle, a guy called Sergeant Simon Fraser from Victoria, he went out often into no man's land. It was no easy task to pick up a man and to carry him on your back, particularly if he had a serious wound or a broken limb. If no stretcher was available, you had to lie down and manoeuvre him onto your shoulders and then stand up in full view of the enemy, possibly flying bullets. And Fraser described the cries of the wounded and how impossible it was for those who heard it just not to respond, despite the danger to the rescuers. One man he heard calling weighed 88 kilos. I wish I was that weight, but it's getting up there a bit, isn't it? And Fraser later wrote, he said, I couldn't lift him on my back. A dead weight of 88 kilos, pretty heavy. Couldn't lift him on my back, but I managed to get him into an old trench and told him to lie quiet while I got a stretcher. And then another man nearby sang out in the famous words, "Don't forget me, cobber." He said, I went in and I got 4 volunteers with stretchers and we got both men to safety. And if you go to Fromell today, you can see the Cobbers Memorial where Andrew Fraser rescued those men. Simon was later killed in the Battle of Buikour on the Western Front. We need to remember that these men were not professional soldiers. They were volunteers. They were ordinary Aussies doing ordinary jobs before enlisting, bakers, bankers and butchers and farmers. One of them by the name of Robert Courtney Green from Western Australia. He was a farmer. He was desperate and facing destitution because of the drought-ravaged farm that he held just outside of Fremantle. And he signed up with the Australian Army in 1916 in the hope that it would solve his problems. He was sent straight to the front line at Fromell to join the fighting. And on that day of that disastrous battle that I've described, he was hit with shrapnel in the chest and he bled to death in the trenches and his body was never recovered. And he left behind his heartbroken fiancée, a girl called Nancy Pearson, a 25-year-old Scottish immigrant. And for years, Nancy penned letters to her missing love, and she would write to him, "My Bob, my love, my handsome, I love you so much." Through the forensic work of a Melbourne schoolteacher by the name of Lambis Iglesias in the late 2000s, the existence of an unmarked and forgotten mass grave containing the remains of hundreds of Allied soldiers killed during the battle was discovered at Pheasant Wood, just a stone's throw from Fromell. The bodies had been transported there by German soldiers on a narrow-gauge trench railway, and they were buried in 8 burial pits. And those grave pits had not been discovered during the post-war burial campaigns. But through the work of Lambis Iglesias, they discovered these pits and a new war cemetery situated as close as possible to those burial pits was established. First one for 50 years. They'd been lying there unknown, And on the 19th of July 2010, that's only a few years ago, isn't it? 2010, 94 years after the battle, 170 soldiers were buried there, and Robert Courtney Green, the love of Nancy's life, was finally laid to rest. But it wasn't all defeat. The ANZAC forces led by Sir John Monash, who has been described as the finest general on the Western Front, became a formidable fighting force with a reputation for bravery and for victory. And long before the great German offensive on the 21st of March 1918, the enemy knew where the strength of the Allied armies lay, and they were careful not to attack where the ANZAC forces were in the front line. After the 8th of August, captured German commanders were admitting that the combination of tanks and Australians coming through the dawn mist was overwhelming. I've got here in my hands the Rising Sun badge. You know the badge? It's worn by ANZAC soldiers, worn by Australian soldiers. This one was found on the battlefield of the Somme, in Western France, on the Western Front in France. It's the badge that's worn by Australian soldiers on their lapels and on their hats. It's the badge under which the original ANZACs went into battle. The badge under which all succeeding Australian soldiers have fought, and it became a symbol of what it means to be Australian. And it reminds me of so many of the iconic battles that have been fought over the last 100 and more years that have demonstrated the ANZAC spirit. There are so many stories that could be told, and I can only mention a few. The Rising Sun badge was worn by the light horsemen in the last great cavalry charge at Beersheba in Palestine, and thank you, Pastor Gideon, for telling us that story. They liberated the wells in the town and recovered 90,000 gallons of fresh, drinkable water for the horses, and as well as other supplies. It was worn at the Battle of Le Hamel, which was fought on the 4th of July 1918, under the leadership of Australian General John Monash. It was an extremely well-planned battle. Monash said, "The battle will last 90 minutes and we'll have the victory." It was over in 92 minutes. It was won at Tobruk, where 14,000 Aussie soldiers were part of a force that held out for 8 months against the best that the German General Rommel could hurl at them, and they became known as the Rats of Tobruk for their stubbornness. In fact, the Rising Sun had a special significance at the Battle of Tobruk for the ANZAC soldiers. As part of the fighting force there was a battalion of Indian soldiers, the Gurkhas. They were fierce fighters. And on the Battle of Tobruk, because it was flat kind of desert area, what would happen is that in the daytime they would dig themselves into a shallow, sandy little trench, and there they would lie all day waiting for the darkness to come. But at night the battlefield would come alive. And the story is told that the Indians, the Gurkhas, would go out and another soldier would be there, and all of a sudden they'd feel an arm come around their neck, and the Gurkha would kind of go for the lapel and feel if there was a Rising Sun badge there, they would say, "She'll be right, mate, away you go." If there was no Rising Sun badge there, you could imagine what happened. The Rising Sun was also worn in Korea from 1950 to 1953. It was worn at Milne Bay. 25th of August 1942, although that battle was a relatively minor one in scale, it was very significant as a morale booster because it was the first real land defeat suffered by the Japanese during the Pacific War. It was worn on the Kokoda Track, where the members of the 39th Regiment, a reserve regiment, the regulars called them the Chocos, because they thought that they would melt when the heat was on. But they held back the Japanese advance over the mountains of Port Moresby, and the stories of the Kokoda Track are of incredible bravery and incredible endurance. It was worn in Singapore and Malaya and Borneo and Sandakan. It was worn at the Battle of Long Tan, Vietnam, where 100 Australian soldiers were attacked by 1,500 Viet Cong guerrillas in a rubber plantation in what was to become Australia's biggest battle during the Vietnam War. It was worn in Iraq and Afghanistan, where Australian soldiers joined the war against terror. So many places, so many stories. We could go on and on. The Australians were good soldiers, but they had a disrespect of authority. They wanted to do their own thing. And they only respected people who earned their respect. The British officers couldn't understand this because they thought they had the respect because of their birthright. Because if they were an officer, they automatically had respect. But the Australians didn't buy that story. The Australian officers had to earn the respect of their men, and they were together in the trenches, officers and their men. One of my favourite stories that demonstrates this comes from Tobruk. And the story is that a very proper British captain decided he would go over to where the Australians were and check out these colonials. And so he got his batman to come with him, and he got his swagger stick under his armpit, and he went over to the Australian trenches. And as he looked in the trenches, there were the Aussies digging in. Boots, shorts, that was it. Sweating away, digging. And they took no notice of him. Here's the British captain on the edge of the trench. And he looked down and he said, "Don't you gentlemen know that you got to salute an officer?" And they took no notice. Why would they? You must salute an officer. And with that, one of the sweating Aussies in the trench got out of the trench, and he reached over and he grabbed his shirt and he put his shirt on with the epaulets of a major. And he said, "Now you can salute." Now you can salute. At Tobruk, the ABC journalist Chester Wilmot, the war correspondent, wrote of the ANZAC, "The spirit which has made Australia is the spirit which has held Tobruk. The inspiring and binding force in Australian life isn't tradition or nationalism or social revolution. It's quite a simple thing. Henry Lawson called it mateship. Mateship. The spirit which makes men stick together. In Australia, by sticking together, men have defied drought, bushfire and flood. In Tobruk, they've scorned hardship and danger and death because no digger would ever let his coppers down. In Tobruk, for the first time in this war," writes Wilmot, "the Germans were thrust back by a spirit that even tanks and dive bombers couldn't conquer." And so the Australian tradition, the spirit of mateship, grew and continues to this day through conflict after conflict, from war to war, and it comes to the front in times of stress and disaster. When calamity strikes, there is a wholly bipartisan response. We see it so often. We saw it in 2011 with the floods here in Brisbane, with the mud army. You remember that? And many of you would have gone out and you'd shoveled mud. I went down to the markets and shoveled mud out there, and other people went in and helped out. We saw it in the raging bushfires just a year or so ago, when people were helping others. We saw it in the current crisis, in what's called the Care Army, where people were helping and giving food parcels and other things to others. And as our country, along with the rest of the world, as the unseen enemy of COVID-19 approaches us, and we're faced with the strange demand of social isolating. You know, we're usually encouraged to stick together, aren't we? And now what is it? Stay apart. 1.5 metres, don't come near me. And we see it 4 square metres. I don't know how you work that out, but anyway. The same spirit of mateship is alive and well today that we see in the ANZACs. And as we live together yet apart and help each other in our everyday lives, and the rising sun under which the ANZAC soldiers fought reminds us that we'll get over this. There will come a time when the sun will rise on a bright tomorrow. We're not abandoned. There is hope. God is still in control. You know, the book of Malachi says, "But you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall arise with healing in his wings." We need that healing. Despite the push for a vaccination, despite all of that, we need the God of heaven to step in and provide that healing for us. How much we need it. How much we need it when we're dismayed to see the news. I've just about given up trying to watch the news. All we see is a litany of suffering and disease and murders and strife and fights and the disastrous results of the current crisis. We need to have that promise deep within our hearts. The Son of Righteousness will arise with healing in his wings. During the height of the lockdown last year, Lindley and I would watch the live stream that came from Springwood Church, which is our church. And then in the afternoon, we would switch over to Loma Linda University Church. And we'd listen to a brilliant sermon by Randy Roberts, who is the senior pastor there. And Randy Roberts, of course, came to camp meeting a few years ago. And I appreciate greatly. In fact, Barry Oliver, our division president, said that Randy's probably one of the best preachers in Adventism. And we enjoyed listening to him. And on this particular day, he reflected on this verse of Scripture, 1 Peter 5 and verse 7. You know it well. Cast all your cares, modern version will say anxiety, on him because he cares for you. A lot of anxiety in the world, isn't there, when you think about it? And Pastor Roberts reminded us that Peter in this text tells us that in these anxious times in which we live, when we're together but apart, we must do one thing and we must know one thing. What you've got to do is to cast all your anxiety on him. Why? Because God is big enough to take care of our anxiety. Say amen to that? God's big enough to take care of anxiety. He can bring that peace which passes understanding. Cast all your anxiety or care on him, says Matthew, and God will give you peace. So that's the thing you've got to do. Cast your anxiety on him. Then the thing that you've got to know to do and to know is that he cares for you. Isn't that a good knowledge to have? God actually cares for you. He knows who you are. He knows the street where you live. He knows your name. He knows the things that bring you happiness. He knows the things that challenge you. He knows all about you. He cares for you. And that's why you can cast your anxiety on him, because that knowledge and assurance can give us confidence as we move into an unknown future. We can be confident that God knows us and he cares for us and is still in control, standing within the shadows, keeping watch upon his own. And so today, this ANZAC Day, we salute all of those who have lost all to preserve our freedoms today. We salute them. The scripture said, greater love has no man than this, than a man lay down his life for his friends. But I want to add more than that today. I want to salute those today who are doing their very best to defeat the current enemy that we face as a world. Those who have to make the decisions. Would you like to have to make the decisions that some of our leaders have got to make? Would you like to stand in their place and make those decisions? And it seems that all they cop is criticism. I salute those who make the decisions, those who have to implement and administer those decisions. It's one thing to make a decision, it's another thing to make it happen, isn't it? I salute those kind of people. I salute those on the front line who risk their lives to care for the sick and dying. We've all heard the stories of those who have actually given their lives to care for others. Those thousands of people support people who keep our essential services going and ensure that we have food and power and water and education for our children. They're worthy of honour too, aren't they? And the rest of us who, albeit reluctantly, abide by the new regulations as we come to church, sign in, find your nominated seat. The rest of us who abide, albeit reluctantly, abide by the new regulations and keep ourselves safe and separated. Australians are good at that. And that's why perhaps we live in one of the best places in the whole of the world at the present time where we can feel safe. We're all together in this, and so on ANZAC Day we acknowledge the contribution to all, the contribution of all to our lives here in Australia. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. The going down of the sun, and in the morning we will remember them, lest we forget.